All right. Well, welcome everybody to our topic today on planning for long-term care costs. So this is a really popular topic. It's one of the main areas of focus for our firm and the type of planning we do for our clients. Um, I appreciate you all joining me on such a lovely day outside and on Cinco de Mayo, and when I'm sure you'd all rather be sitting out in the yard and doing yard work and all of that. So thank you for joining us today. If you're participating via Zoom, you can, just a reminder that this is interactive. So is the ability for you to ask questions and, as I'm going through things, if anything is unclear or you have sort of a related question that you want to ask about long-term care, please feel free to submit that into the Q&A little chat box that you have. That'll let me see it pop up and I can answer it as we go. Otherwise, if you have any questions after the fact, you can always set up a time to come and talk to one of us too. So you'll be receiving a feedback form after this, an email form that will give you a place where you can fill out if you would like us to reach out to you to set up an initial consultation. Those are complimentary. They don't cost you anything. We usually schedule them for about 2 hours. So if anything I talk about today raises concerns for you, or you'd like to talk about it about you or a loved one, please feel free to fill it out. And we won't reach out to you unless you fill it out. So filling it out just lets us know that you would like us to do so. But welcome everybody. I'm Attorney Justin Randall here with Hooper Law Office. And again, just another reminder, our topic today is planning for long-term care costs. So long-term care, generally, when we're talking about that, we're referring to things like potentially at-home care, assisted living facilities, or skilled nursing facilities. So not just long-term disability necessarily, but actually care where someone is, that type of long-term care where you're receiving care at a facility like that, where you're generally thinking of, older end of life care, but it can also be care for people who have long-term disabilities that they're not able to take care of themselves at their own home, or have someone come into the home either. So this can apply to a lot of different people. But a couple of things to get started before I go too much into like how you actually plan for these types of expenses. I want to explain a little bit about what kind of expenses you can expect when you're looking at long-term care. So the range of care is really going to factor in heavily into how much somebody ends up paying for their care, as you would expect, and also the amount of care, or the span of care is going to factor into the overall cost by the end of someone's life as well. So one of the cheaper options potentially, but also potentially one of the most expensive, is at-home care. So, we have a lot of clients who their main goal is to stay at home and receive care in the home as long as possible. And that's a really admirable goal, but sometimes it's just not what is the best for people either. I would hope that we could have it so all of my clients would never have to have any form of long-term care, would be able to, pass peacefully in their home and not have to ever leave the home if that's possible. But it's not always possible for everybody. But if someone just needs a little bit of care, a little bit of assistance, there are at-home care organizations where they'll generally have a nurse on staff, somebody come in, help with medication, maybe daily activities, things like that. And that can be the cheapest. You generally hear, this is going to range depending on the organization, but you hear things about people who, the average going rate maybe is $25 an hour for care. So, that doesn't sound too bad. And if it's only a couple hours a day, or maybe, under 20 hours a week, possibly something like that, you're looking at, that's not too bad, right? That's a generally affordable amount of care for someone at home, for a lot of people anyway. But if you extrapolate that $25 per hour over, around the clock care, it's easily the most expensive care that somebody can have too. You're looking at it outpacing the cost of care for a skilled nursing facility. So generally, otherwise the highest level of care that someone might need. So this type of care is great if it's, if it's what someone needs, but you also don't want to rely on it for too long if it's not what's right for somebody anymore, or if it starts to become more expensive than other care options. And another thing that people often talk about is providing care for loved ones too. and to help limit those expenses for care. And I'll get into that a little bit too, and how it sort of relates to, if you tuned in for our topic last week, a little bit similar to that topic. So, $25 an hour can be the cheapest level of care, can be the most expensive, depending on the time per week or per month that someone is receiving care at home. Next level up is generally what you would consider, assisted living facilities. Assisted living facilities being you need some assistance, but you don't need like the round the clock nursing home care, or a nurse always on staff to provide the highest level of care that someone might need with a skilled nursing facility. So the range for this cost of care, again, it's going to vary depending on the level of care someone needs and what their specific care plan is. But generally, you see in the neighborhood of $6,000 on the low end, I would say. I've seen below that, but it's pretty uncommon. Up to about $8,000 per month. And that $8,000 is generally more when somebody needs memory care or some form of, they have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia, but they don't quite need skilled nursing. So that's memory care tends to be on the upper end of that. So again, $6,000 to $8,000 a month is expensive, and not a lot of people in retirement have the income to make that up. So what it ends up being is people start to look at, okay, how long are my assets going to last, or what other ways do I have available to me to help pay for this care? Highest level of care I mentioned, other than round the clock at home care, would be skilled nursing facilities. And that's generally when someone is, it really needs assistance. There's a lot of different activities of daily living, they call it, that they would need assistance with. They have very high care needs, or just really need round the clock monitoring, things like that. That on average, again, there's a range, but you're going to see it more likely to be in the $10,000 to $11,000 per month range. So you can see how this is not the type of funds that a lot of people in retirement would have available to them, because at $10,000 a month, you're looking at $120,000 a year. And somebody, your average retiree who may be using, standard Social Security, maybe some things from a retirement account or a pension. I mean, $120,000 per year in retirement is still not a very common thing. And you also need to factor in not just the cost of care, but how do you provide for maybe one of the spouses at home who is not receiving care? You don't want to impoverish them or take funds away from them that they need to live their lives either. So there's a lot of different factors that you need to calculate into this in terms of what affording care looks like, or how to pay for care. Another thing with these facilities, like assisted living facilities or skilled nursing facilities, some facilities will accept Medicaid right away. And Medicaid is the program that people will use long-term to pay for long-term care, not Medicare. So Medicare it will cover 100 days, some portion of 100 days, covers the first 20 days, 100%, and then the remaining 80 days, it will cover some portion of it. And they have to show that, but for the care that you're receiving, you would be declining for those days to be covered. So it will cover some portion of it, and it will cover rehabilitative stays at a long-term care facility. That's Medicare, that is, but it will not cover indefinite stays. After that point, you're paying out of pocket. So that's when people look at other mechanisms to pay for care, which often involves Medicaid for a lot of people. So when you're talking about how to afford the cost of care, not including certain means-based programs like Medicaid, the number one thing I would recommend someone take a look at is, if they haven't already, look into long-term care insurance. That is not the same thing as like long-term disability insurance that you might get through work, or like you see on the Aflac commercials, right? This is a specific type of insurance that is specifically designed to pay for at-home care, assisted living, or skilled nursing facilities. And it will usually pay a maximum amount over someone's lifetime, or a maximum daily amount. And there's a lot of varieties to these types of policies. So if you got one 20 years ago, you might have seen where it's a policy that pays a certain amount over someone's lifetime, but it's kind of use or lose it, right? If you don't end up needing long-term care, you don't get the money back that you've paid in. A lot of policies today, though, are some sort of combination between like a life insurance product or an annuity product that can also be used for your long-term care expenses during your lifetime, especially the death benefit of the life insurance products. But if you don't end up using it, it pays out, right, to either yourself or the beneficiaries of your estate. So that is what we see more commonly these days. And when this is generally a good idea to look at this is sometime in your mid to later 50s, maybe early to mid 60s too. Once you start to get beyond that point, it's not that they will necessarily deny someone right away. It's just that it's more expensive, right? It's based off of how old you are, what your care or your health situation might be, things like that. So, I mean, that's all factored in. And if it would also definitely be difficult for someone to receive if they have a diagnosis such as Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, because the companies are aware that you're going to likely need care for a longer period of time than someone who otherwise is just physically needs care in a facility. The memory care patients tend to need care for the longest because it's not necessarily, at least not right away, a physical ailment, right? It can become one though. So long-term care insurance is a great tool to help pay for a couple of years. Generally, you're almost certainly not going to find one that covers indefinitely anymore. We used to see policies like that. I still see some people who have had them for 20, 25 years still have those. And I tell them, don't you dare get rid of this because you will never find it again. But it's not common that they'll pay out indefinitely. But really, you only need a policy that's going to cover, generally 2 to 3 years, I would say, is a good kind of ballpark estimate of care. And the reason for that is a lot of these facilities, I said some accept Medicaid right away, but not all of them do. And a lot more and more are starting to require that you show you can privately pay out of pocket for 1 to 2 years is kind of the average. I would imagine at some point you'll start to see 2 to 3 years as care costs increase and they're trying to cover their expenses more, right? This type of care is expensive for them to provide as well. So if you have those 2 to 3 years of coverage, though, you can essentially have your pick of the litter for the facilities that you would want. You can get care where you want, location-wise, in terms of the amenities at the facilities you might want. You can kind of pick and choose a little bit more. You have the ability to say, I don't like the amenities at this facility, but I like them here. And it can also be in terms of the care needs that you have. Does this one facility have the ability to provide care for what your needs might be? The more you're able to privately pay, the more choice you have, as with most things in life, right? So this long-term care insurance is a way to help you pay for that private pay requirement, so that once you've made it through their agreed upon 2 years or so, 1 to 2 years, after that point, if you do have to, say you did have to be on Medicaid right away, you had spent through all of your assets somehow, or you just didn't have any other assets to pay privately for care. Well, at that point, if you've agreed with the facility for those 1 to 2 years and you've met your obligation, they then have to accept you on Medicaid. If that is what needs to happen. Some facilities don't accept Medicaid at all, but you would want to know that before you decided to pick that facility, right? It would not be something that you would go into without asking that question and knowing in advance. And some people, quite frankly, can privately pay indefinitely. If you're looking at someone with, they're a multimillionaire, you're not going to worry too much about their ability to private pay for a long period of time, especially when you're factoring in their income that they might be receiving. So those are not the people that I'm generally concerned about trying to protect things, because they're sort of self-funded throughout that. But a lot of people aren't. And even generally, people who have saved their whole lives, people who are upper middle class, sometimes even, they may not have the ability to pay indefinitely, especially for both spouses, because it can be so expensive. I mean, if you're looking at the upper level of care, and that's $10,000 per person per month, you're looking at $20,000 a month, right? $240,000 a year. And you can see how even with somebody with $1 million, $2 million, how that could eat that up pretty quickly in 5 to 10 years if you're not factoring in for income too. So when we're looking at helping someone pay for long-term care, other means, if long-term care insurance isn't an option for someone, if they don't have the ability to privately fund it, things like that, that's when we're looking at programs like Medicaid, which I've already sort of mentioned, where someone is receiving assistance through the state Medicaid program in order to provide payment for that facility. And the reason that people don't just automatically go on Medicaid right away is because there are both asset and income limitations to it. So your income for Medicaid has to be lower than your cost of care, right? You can't be still netting income from that. Otherwise, that would be not enough to qualify. So I'll start with a few different points of information where Medicaid in particular varies whether you are single or married. If you are a single person, it's pretty straightforward what you're allowed to keep on Medicaid. You can keep your primary residence, but they will place a lien on it as they provide care. So they can't force you to sell it right away, but they can eventually eat up the equity of it if you're single. And this is, by the way, as they're providing care. It's not like they just take it right away. Or you might have heard the nursing home, people being afraid of the nursing home taking their home. That's not what happens. It's that Medicaid tells them what they're allowed to keep. And Medicaid also has a program in Wisconsin called the state recovery, where they can take certain amounts from someone's estate for the care they've provided after they've passed. So that's generally what is actually happening. But that single person, like I said, can keep the home, but they will place a lien on it. They can have a life insurance policy of not more than $1,500, so $1,500 in face value. If it is over that face value amount, they will then look at any cash value that you have in that policy as an asset, as a cash asset. You can keep one vehicle regardless of value. And so that's the idea for that, is like transportation to medical appointments, things like that. And then as a single person, the most you can keep in terms of other assets is about $2,000 in assets. But generally you want to be under that so you don't accidentally kick yourself off of Medicaid every month. And then in terms of income, all of your income has to go towards your cost of care, except for $45 a month. That's what they consider your basically your allowance you're getting for Medicaid for personal needs, which is a little silly because $45 a month is not enough to cover most things anymore, let alone a lot of different things that somebody might need. And Medicaid does not cover everybody's expenses for everything, right? It covers the care needs that they've agreed to cover with that facility. It might not pay for a private room at the facility. It might not pay for, going out to eat, right? Or it definitely won't pay for going out to eat or haircuts, or the facility might not have those options available for haircuts. A lot are starting to, but not everyone does. So the question becomes not just how do you pay for care, but how do you have the quality of life that you're looking to have too. So for a married couple, though, it's a little different. What the community spouse gets to keep, and the community spouse is what we call the spouse who's living at home, or they're still healthy, right? They're not the one receiving care. This is what Medicaid calls them, as the community spouse. Then Medicaid refers to the spouse receiving care as the institutionalized spouse, which sounds it doesn't sound good, but that's just the term they use. So the spouse living at home can keep the home with no lien placed on it while they're still living there. They can keep any sort of qualified retirement accounts that they have. So things like IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, those types of retirement accounts, not just an account you have for your retirement, but specifically those types of qualified retirement accounts. Those are exempt from their spouse's cost of care. So if it is their retirement account, it is exempt from their spouse's cost of care. The same sort of life insurance limits are there, that $1,500 of face value, and anything above that, they'll count the cash value as an asset. The same thing with the car. You can have the one car. I forgot to mention this for a single person, but this is the same for married or single. You can prepay a funeral burial policy up to about $15,000. And it has to be irrevocably assigned, meaning you can't just take the money back out of it. It has to be that you can't get it back. And then they will pool together all of the married couple's assets, whether it is individually titled or jointly titled, for things like additional real estate, checking accounts, savings accounts, the retirement accounts of the spouse who is receiving care, Basically any other asset that is not something that is specifically exempt is countable for Medicaid. And they look at what the total value of that is combined. So let's say, for example, here that somebody has $200,000 of what Medicaid calls a countable asset. They look at that $200,000 in that example, they divide it in half, and that half needs to fall within a range, right? So Medicaid says they can't force someone to spend below $50,000, but you also can't keep more than roughly $130,000, which that upper number goes up every year with inflation. So in my example, that half of $200,000 is $100,000. And if your half falls within that range of 50 to 130,000, you keep whatever that half is. That's what you have to spend down to. So when you hear people talk about spending down, they're talking about spending down to what they're allowed to keep for Medicaid qualification. So if you're within that range, you keep whatever that number is. But if, say, somebody only had $50,000 total as a married couple, they don't have to spend down to $25,000. They're already at the lowest limit there. And if your half fell above that 130 upper limit, you can't keep more than it. You have to still spend down to that 130 roughly of available assets. So just to help you guys conceptualize this does not mean you have to spend down to $130,000 total, right? If somebody was at that upper limit. That's in addition to the exempt assets that you may already have as the community spouse. Another thing with income for married couples is the community spouse can keep all of their income. They do not have to put any of their income towards their spouse's cost of care. If their income falls below about $2,800 a month, then they can keep enough of their spouse's income that is receiving care to bring them up to that amount. So if somebody was only receiving $1,000 from Social Security every month, but their spouse who was receiving care was receiving $3,800 a month from pension, Social Security, all of that, they could take $1,800 of their income and take it as their own, so that they were up to that $2,800. So just to give you an idea of, you're not completely without that spouse's income who's receiving care. Now, the rest of their income over that amount, but for that $45 a month in income that the spouse in the facility is allowed to keep, that's where the rest of it has to go directly to the facility to help supplement Medicaid's cost of care. So, married couples and single people are allowed to keep different amounts. If both spouses are receiving care, you don't get to keep that same amount of exempt assets. It's a maximum of $3,000 per couple. At that point is the max assets. I mean, in addition to, the prepaid funeral policy, the, $1,500 life insurance. And again, the home is not sold right away, but they'll place a lien on it. So when you're talking about affording care or, using Medicaid as a way to pay for care, it's not a magic bullet for this either, because there's other planning that needs to go into it, or else somebody is just stuck spending down to the point where they financially qualify. So people often look at different ways then to help protect things from that spend down. But before I go into that, there is another program that we use specifically for veterans. It's called the Improved Pension Program. If you're a veteran, you may have heard of like aid and attendance. It's a pension benefit for wartime veterans who were served for at least 90 days of active duty. Only one of those 90 days has to actually have been during a wartime period, which are defined by the VA specifically. It's not necessarily either what you would think of as a traditional wartime period. Like World War II, according to the VA, ended in 1946, for example, not the 1945 you might be familiar with from like history textbooks. So if you're a wartime veteran, only one of those 90 days actually have to have fallen of those active duty has to have fallen during the wartime period. So you could have been the first day of your active duty was right at the end of one of those periods. That still technically qualifies. You don't have to have been boots on the ground. You could have been stationed anywhere in the world, even in the US, as long as you were active duty. Couldn't have been in the reserves, for example, and not been activated as active duty. There's some exceptions to that. And you can't have been dishonorably discharged. So if you meet those service requirements, then this VA program is potentially available to veterans or their spouses, or surviving spouses. And it is a direct pension directly to the veteran or their spouse. It is paid to them. It's not like paid to the facility. And it is up to about somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2,400 a month for the veteran themselves, usually in the neighborhood of $1,600 or so, or $1,400 to $1,600 for their surviving spouse. Those numbers also go up with inflation every year, so I don't have the exact numbers in my head right now. But just like Medicaid, there are also asset limitations and income limitations for that program. So it's a little simpler for you if you're a veteran, whether you're married or single, they have the same asset limitations, thankfully. So you don't have to go into the same calculations like you would with Medicaid. But for the veteran, the VA Improved Pension Program, in order to qualify asset-wise, you are allowed to keep the home and up to 2 acres surrounding the home. So if you have like a separate plot of land and that's 40 acres, that's not exempt. Or even if you had your primary home and 40 acres surrounding it, not all of those 40 acres would be exempt from their asset calculations. But if it's a home and up to 2 acres directly surrounding the land, that is not even counted against you as part of your total assets. And then it's pretty simple for the VA. Pretty much everything else, cash value wise, retirement accounts, regardless of which spouse's retirement account it is, everything else, you're allowed to keep also about $130,000. So there's no dividing in half like there is with Medicaid, but they tried to use the same kind of upper limit of Medicaid, but of course it's slightly different because federal government programs don't always play nice together with those. So they used a different inflation number. So it's about $130,000 in addition to someone's exempt primary residence. You can technically have more than 2 acres surrounding the home if there are local zoning ordinance laws that say you can't sell a lot under a certain size. So if it was said you lived somewhere rural and it said the lot had to be at least 10 acres in order to sell, well, then you could have 10 acres of land surrounding the home. But it very much so depends on local zoning ordinances. So this is a really good benefit to use for wartime veterans or their surviving spouses to help pay for like sometimes the private pay requirement or programs like that, or programs like that, periods of like that where you're looking at home care or the private pay, 1 to 2 years, it can help get you through that. The income requirements for the VA, there's no set amount that you have to be below, but how the VA calculates your income is if you have a certain amount of income coming in and then you have unreimbursed medical expenses, which would be long-term care expenses, then they deduct your unreimbursed medical expenses from your total income that you're receiving. And in theory, that could mean in the VA's eyes, you have zero income because your expenses might exceed your actual income that you're getting. And then based off of how much income, they call it IVAP, income for VA purposes, that you have left, that will lower the benefit that you're allowed to get that from that, $1,800 to $2,400 that I was talking about. So if I had $1,000 of income for the VA's eyes, then that would lower the pension I would get. But for a lot of people in long-term care, it lowers it completely down to zero if it's a high enough level of care. So the question we get, and I talked over a little bit on this, so because this stuff can be complicated, but I'll try to give you a good rundown of how you can plan for this and how you can help protect certain assets. So people try to qualify or help themselves get qualified for these programs by, you may have heard of strategies like gifting it to the kids, or the home to the kids, putting the home in the kids' name, or transferring assets over time to them. And this sounds like really good planning, but the problem is without consulting somebody who practices in elder law in particular, you might be creating more problems than you're solving. I'll give you an example with the home, since I am running short on time here, and this is a really good example to use. But when you are trying to protect the value of your home from long-term care, people will talk about putting it in the kid's name. This is not a good idea for a couple reasons. Number one, when you put the home in the kid's name, you are potentially opening it up to other liabilities. So I might get it out of my name, and it's, after the Medicaid's 5-year look back period that you might have heard from or heard about, after I've made it out more than 5 years, it might not be available for my cost of care. But what if one of my kids gets sued, or they get divorced, or they have long-term care expenses come up, like because of a disability, or they file for bankruptcy? Well, you might have just opened up the home to a bunch of liabilities that they have too, because now they're the owner of the home, and anything that happens to the home or happens to the owner of the property happens to that property as well. Another big concern is that it is just a huge loss of control. So hopefully your kids would never do this to you, but in theory, if somebody else owns the property now, you're now just a tenant, right? And they can evict you, they can charge you rent, they can sell the property. Those things they're allowed to do, legally speaking. And then finally, it's just really bad tax planning. And there's some talk about eliminating the step up in basis upon someone's death, but currently nothing is in law. But when you gift a home over to somebody, you are, when you have a cost basis in the property, and if you're unfamiliar, think of it as basically, what did I buy this property for, this home for? That's your cost basis in a very oversimplified kind of example. So if I bought my home in 1950 for $50,000 and then I gifted it over to my kids, the IRS, when the kids sell the home at that or later on, are going to look at that $50,000 as their cost basis, which means when they sell the property, whatever the actual fair market value is, the difference is what they have to pay capital gains tax on. Now, you don't have to generally worry about capital gains tax when you sell your home, because you have an exclusion of $250,000 of capital gains per spouse. So potentially up to $500,000, right? But in order to get that exclusion, you have to have been the resident of the home, and it has to have been your primary residence for 2 of the last 5 tax years, right? So your kids generally don't fall into that, but sometimes they do. So when you pass away and you leave that asset to them later, and it goes through an estate, through your estate as part of a trust or a will, then you get a step up in cost basis up to fair market value. And that means when they sell the home, it's going to look like either little or no gain at all to the IRS. So they may not have to pay any tax on it. So it's just better tax planning to try to pass it through an estate. And how do we do this while also helping to protect things from long-term care expenses? That's when we're generally looking at what you might have heard of as an irrevocable trust. It's the same sort of situations apply where you still want to absolutely trust your kids, because when you set up that irrevocable trust, you're going to name some of them, generally speaking, as trustees, not yourself. So, but with that irrevocable trust, they cannot evict you. They can't charge you rent. Can't sell the property without your permission. In exchange, you have to pay property taxes and utility bills like you normally do. So you're protected from sort of all of those other situations that might come up. Also, their own liabilities are not an issue, because as trustees, they are not owners of the trust. They just manage it. So that's generally the safer way to go. We still like to do this planning with about 5 years in advance of someone needing care, or more if we can help it, because this still does count as a divestment for that Medicaid 5-year look back period. So you still want to plan ahead, but it doesn't mean that you're creating all of those other liabilities that I mentioned too, as if you just gifted the asset to the kids. The big thing too is if you don't have those 5 years, say you're already receiving care, or one of your spouses is already receiving care, or you think it's coming up very quickly here, and you probably don't have 5 years, there's still planning we can do to protect usually about 50 to 60% of someone's estate of what they have, so that one, they don't have to spend down through everything, and maybe the community spouse has enough to provide equal amounts for their care when that time comes as well. So you're not out of luck if you don't have those 5 years. It just means that you absolutely, if that is a concern of yours coming up, you need to talk to somebody who practices in elder law, and usually some combination of elder law and estate planning is a pretty common mix that you'll see. I always tell people you're only really out of luck and unable to do anything planning wise if you've already spent down to nothing, because we can't get money back. So if you have money left that you're looking to protect, you still have time. You just need to act quickly on it. And if that is a concern of yours, just to close it out, we do have that feedback form if you're participating via Zoom that you'll be receiving via email that you can set up an initial consultation with one of us. Again, those are complimentary. We do usually schedule them for about 2 hours to give us enough time to talk through the situation for either yourself or your loved one. If you're watching this back later, you can always give our office a call to set up time too, or email learnmore@hooperlawoffice.com to set something up. Just to finish off, one last thing before I let you guys go for the rest of the day, our topic coming up next week is planning for if you're if you have foster children that you're planning to adopt, there's specific things that you want to incorporate into your estate plan. And that's going to be our topic coming up next week. So sorry, I kept you guys a little long, but this is a information heavy topic. So I wanted to get you the important information. But otherwise, if you have any questions, like I said, please reach out to us. Otherwise, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you guys next week.